On June 5, 1940, Prime Minister Winston Churchill issued a statement to the Houses of Parliament, rallying patriotism in England and lamenting on the military disaster that was the Battle of France. This is "We Shall Fight on the Beaches" by Winston Churchill. From the moment that the French defenses at Sedan and on the Mayus were broken, only a rapid retreat to Amiens in the south could have saved the French and British armies. Therefore, when the force and scope of the German penetration were realized, an effort was made by the French and British armies to keep on holding the right hand of a newly created French army, which was to have advanced across the Somme in great strength to grasp it. However, the German eruption swept like a sharp scythe around the right and rear of the armies of the north. Behind this armored and mechanized onslaught came a number of German divisions in lorries, and behind them again there plodded comparatively slowly the dull brute mass of the ordinary German army and German people, always so ready to be led to the trampling down in other lands of liberties and comforts which they have never known in their own. I have said this armored scythe almost reached Dunkirk. Almost, but not quite. Boulogne and Calais were the scenes of desperate fighting. The Guards defended Boulogne and were then withdrawn by orders from the country. Thus, it was the port of Dunkirk was kept open. It seemed indeed forlorn. The Belgian, British, and French armies were almost surrounded. Their sole line of retreat was to a single port and to its neighboring beaches. They were pressed on every side by heavy attacks and far outnumbered in the air. When a week ago today, I asked the House to fix this afternoon as the occasion for a statement, I feared it would be my hard lot to announce the greatest military disaster in our long history. I thought that perhaps 20,000 or 30,000 men might be re-embarked. These were the hard and heavy tidings for which I called upon the House and the nation. The whole root and core of the British army seemed about to perish upon the field or to be led into an ignominious and starving captivity. I asked the House a week ago to suspend its judgment because the facts were not clear. But I do not feel that any reason now exists why we should not form our own opinions upon this pitiful episode. The enemy attacked on all sides with great strength and fierceness, and their main power, the power of their far more numerous air force, was thrown into the battle, or else concentrated upon Dunkirk and the beaches. Both from the east and the west, the enemy began to fire with cannons upon the beaches. They sowed magnetic mines in the channels and seas. They sent repeated waves of hostile aircraft to cast their bombs upon the single pier that remained. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy, with the willing help of countless merchant seamen, strained every nerve to embark the British and Allied troops. They had to operate on the difficult coast, often in adverse weather, under an almost ceaseless hail of bombs and an increasing concentration of artillery fire. It was in conditions such as these that our men carried on, making trip after trip across the dangerous waters, bringing with them always men who they had rescued. The numbers they had brought back are the measure of their devotion and courage. The hospital ships, which brought off many thousands of British and French wounded, being so plainly marked, they were a special target for Nazi bombs. But the men and women on board never faltered in their duty. Nevertheless, our thankfulness at the escape of our army and so many men must not blind us to the fact that what has happened in France and Belgium is a colossal military disaster. The French army has been weakened. The Belgian army has been lost. Many valuable mining districts and factories have passed into the enemy's possession. The whole of the Channel's ports are in his hands, with all the tragic consequences that follow from that. And we must expect another blow to be struck immediately at us or at France. We We are told that Hitler has a plan for invading the British Isles. This has been often thought of before. When Napoleon lay at Boulogne for a year with his flat-bottomed boats and his grand army, he was told by someone, "There are bitter weirds in England." There are certainly a great many more of them since the British Expeditionary Force returned. I know there are a great many people affected by the orders which we have made who are the passionate enemies of Nazi Germany. I am very sorry for them. But we cannot, at the present time and under the present stress, draw all the distinctions which we should like to do. And to the question of invasion, I would observe that there has never been a period in all these long centuries of which we boast when an absolute guarantee against invasion could have been given to our people. I have myself full confidence that if all do their duty, if nothing is neglected, and if the best arrangements are made, as they are being made, we shall prove ourselves once again able to defend our island home, to ride out the storm of war, and to outlive the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. That is the resolve of His Majesty's government, every man of them. That is the will of Parliament and the nation, the British Empire and the French Republic, linked together in their cause and in their need, will defend to the death their native soil, aiding each other like good comrades to the utmost of their strength. Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of the Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. And if, for which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until in God's good time, the new world, in all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old.
The enemy attacked on all sides with great strength and fierceness, and their main power, the power of their far more numerous air force, was thrown into the battle, or else concentrated upon Dunkirk and the beaches. On June 4th, 1940, after the retreat at Dunkirk, President Winston Churchill delivered the speech, "We shall fight on the beaches," to counter public reaction, after our military had been portrayed as non-dedicated, and to encourage young men to enlist into the armed forces. Churchill was an incredibly influential leader throughout World War II. This is one of the many impactful speeches he gave during wartime. Pressing in upon the narrow exit, both from the east and from the west, the enemy began to fire with cannon upon the beaches by which alone the shipping could approach or depart. They sowed magnetic mines in the channels and the seas. They sent repeated waves of hostile aircraft, sometimes more than 100 strong in one formation. They would cast their bombs upon the single pier that remained, and upon those sand dunes upon which the troops had their eyes for shelter, their U-boats, one of which was sunk, and their motor launches took their toll on the vast traffic which now began. For 4 or 5 days, an intense struggle reigned. All their armor divisions, or what was left of them, together with great masses of infantry and artillery, hurled themselves in the vein upon the ever-narrowing, ever-contracting appendix within which the British and the French armies fought. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy, with the willing help of the countless merchant seamen, strained every nerve to embark the British and the Allied troops. 220 light warships and 650 other vessels were engaged. They had to operate upon the difficult coast, often in adverse weather, under an almost ceaseless hail of bombs, and an increasing concentration of artillery fire. Nor were the seas, if I have said, themselves free from the mines and the torpedoes. It was in conditions such as these that our men carried on, with little or no rest, for days and nights on end, making trip after trip across dangerous waters, bringing with them always men whom they had rescued. The numbers that they have brought back are the measure of their devotion and their courage. The hospital ships, which brought off many thousands of British and French wounded, being so plainly marked, were a special target for the Nazi bombs. But these men and women on board them never faltered in their duty. Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force, which had already been intervening in the battle so far as the trains would allow from home bases, now used part of its main metropolitan fighter strength and struck at the German bombers and at the fighters which in large numbers protected them. This struggle was protracted and fierce. Suddenly, the scene is cleared. The crash and the thunder has, for that moment, but only for that moment, died away. A miracle of deliverance, achieved by valor, by perseverance, by perfect discipline, by faultless service, by resource, by skill, by unconquerable fidelity, is manifest to us all. The enemy had been hurled back by the retreating British and French troops. He was so roughly handled that he did not hurry their departure seriously. The Royal Air Force engaged the main strength of the German Air Force and inflicted upon them losses of at least 4-1. And the Navy, using nearly 1,000 ships of all kinds, carried over 335,000 men, French and British, out of the jaws and death of shame, to their native land with the task which lay immediately ahead. However, we must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Our wars are not won by evacuations, but there was a victory inside this deliverance that should be noted. It was gained by our Air Force. Many of our soldiers coming back had never seen our Air Force at work. They saw only the bombers which escaped its protective attack, and they underrate our achievements. So, I will pay my tribute to these young men, the Knights of the Round Table, the Crusaders. They all fall back into the past, not only distant, but prosaic. These young men going forth every morn to guard their native land, and all that we stand for, holding in their hands these instruments of colossal and shattering power, of whom it may be said that every morning brought forth a noble chance, and every chance brought forth a noble knight. They deserve our gratitude, as do all the brave men who in so many ways and on so many occasions are ready, and continue ready to give their life for their native land. I return to the Army. In a long series of very fierce battles, now on this front, now on that front, fighting on 3 fronts at once, battles fought by 2 or 3 divisions against an equal or somewhat larger number of our enemy, and fiercely fought on some of the old grounds that so many of us knew so well in these battles. Our losses in men have exceeded 30,000 killed, wounded, and missing. I take this occasion to express my sympathy of the House to all who have suffered the bereavement or who are still anxious. The President of the Board of Trade, Sir Andrew Duncan, is not here today. His son has been killed, and many in the House have felt the pangs of affliction in the sharpest form. We have had a large number of the wounded come home safely to this country, but I will say this about the missing, that there may be very many reported missing who will come home someday, in one way or another. In the confusion of this fight, it is inevitable that many have been left in positions where honor required no further resistance from them. Against our losses of number 30,000 men, we can set a far heavier loss certainly inflicted upon our enemy. Nevertheless, our thankfulness at the escape of our army and so many men whose loved ones had to suffer through an agonizing week must not blind us to the fact that what had happened in France and Belgium is a colossal military disaster.
The veil of hope can often blind us from the truth, and the fear of conflict can often lead to damaging silence. In an act that would have been considered treason had the war fell in favor of Great Britain, Patrick Henry, one of the founders of our nation at the 1775 Second Virginia Convention, set out to convince the colonies to raise a militia against Great Britain in his speech, "Liberty or Death." This is no time for ceremony. The question before the House is one of awful moment to this country. For my own part, I consider it as nothing less than a question of freedom or slavery. and in proportion to the magnitude of the subject ought to be the freedom of the debate. It is only in this way that we can arrive at truth and fulfill the great responsibility which we hold to God and to our country. Should I keep back my opinions at such a time, at fear of giving offense, I should consider myself as guilty of treason and of an act of disloyalty toward the majesty of heaven, which I revere above all earthly kings. Mr. President, it is natural for man to indulge in the illusions of hope. We are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth and listen to the song of that siren till she transforms us into beasts. Is this the part of wise men, engaged in a great and arduous struggle for liberty? Are we to be disposed of the number of those who, having eyes, see not, and having ears, hear not, the things which so nearly concern their temporal salvation? For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it may cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it. I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know of no way of judging of the future but by the past, and judging by the past, I wish to know what there has been in the conduct of the British ministry for the past 10 years to justify those hopes with which gentlemen have been pleased to solace themselves in the House. Is it that insidious smile to which our petitions have been lately received? Trust it not, sir. It will prove a snare to your feet. Trust yourselves not to be betrayed with a kiss. Ask yourselves how this gracious reception of our petitions comports with those warlike preparations that cover our waters and darken our lands. Are fleets and armies necessary to a work of love and reconciliation? Have we shown ourselves so unwilling to be reconciled that force must be called in to win back our love? Let us not deceive ourselves, sir. These are the implements of war and subjugation, the last argument to which kings resort. I ask, gentlemen, sir, what means this martial array if its purpose be not to force us into submission? Can gentlemen assign any other possible motive for it? Does Great Britain have any enemy in this quarter of the world to call for all this accumulation of armies and navies? No, sir, she has none. They are meant for us. They can be meant for no other. They are sent over to bind and rivet upon us those chains which the British ministry have been so long forging. And what have we to oppose them? Shall we try argument? Sir, we have been trying that for the last 10 years. Have we anything new to offer upon the subject? Nothing. We have held the subject up in every light of which it is capable, but it has been all in vain. Shall we resort to entreaty and humble supplication? What terms shall we find that have not been already exhausted? Let us not, I beseech you, sir, deceive ourselves. Sir, we have done everything that could be done to avert the storm which is now coming on. We have petitioned, we have remonstrated, we have supplicated, we have prostrated ourselves before the throne and have implored its interposition to arrest the tyrannical hands of the ministry and parliament. Our petitions have been slighted. Our remonstrances have produced additional violence and insult. Our supplications have been disregarded, and we have been spurned with contempt from the foot of the throne. In vain after these things when we indulge in the fond hope of peace and reconciliation. There is no longer any room for hope. If we wish to be free, if we mean to preserve, inviolate those inestimable privileges for which we have been so long contending, if we mean not basely to abandon the noble struggle in which we have been so long engaged, in which we have pledged ourselves never to abandon until the glorious object of our contest shall be obtained, we must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight. An appeal to arms and to the God of hosts is all that is left us. They tell us, sir, that we are weak, unable to cope with so formidable an adversary. But when shall we be stronger? Will it be next week or next year? Will it be when we are totally disarmed and there is a British guard stationed in every house? Shall we gather strength by irresolution and inaction? Shall we acquire the means of effectual resistance by lying supinely on our backs and hugging the delusive phantom of hope until our enemies shall have bound us hand and foot? Sir, we are not weak if we make proper use of those means which the God of nature hath placed in our power. The millions of people armed in the holy cause of liberty and in a country such as that which we possess are invincible by any force to which our enemies can bring upon us. Besides, sir, we do not fight our battles alone. There is a just God who presides over the destinies of nations and who will raise up friends to fight our battles for us. The battle, sir, is not to the strong alone. It is to the vigilant, the active, the brave. Besides, sir, we have no election. If we were base enough to desire it, it is now too late to retire from the contest. There is no retreat, but in submission and slavery. Our chains are forged. Their clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat it, sir. Let it come. It is in vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death.
I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it. And while there is that criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. Eugene Debs was a labor activist and an advocate for democracy. When the First World War broke out, Debs was arrested under the Espionage Act for a speech he gave criticizing America's involvement in the war and of the Wilson administration itself. He said that the nature of war consisted of the master class declaring the wars while the subject class fights all of the battles. The following is Debs' statement to the court following his conviction, but before his sentencing. Your Honor, I have listened to all that was done in this court in support and justification of this prosecution, but my mind remains unchanged. I look upon the espionage law as a despotic anatomy, in flagrant conflict with the democratic principles and with the spirit of free institutions. Your Honor, I have stated in this court that I am opposed to the social system in which we live, that I believe in a fundamental change, but if possible, by peaceful and orderly means. Standing here this morning, recall my boyhood. At 14, I went to work in a railroad shack. At 16, I was firing a freight engine up on a railroad. I remember all of the hardships and privations of that earlier day. And from that time until now, my heart has been with the working class. I could have been in Congress long ago, but I have preferred to go to prison. I'm thinking this morning of the men in the mills and the factories, of the men in the mines and on the railroads. I'm thinking of the women, for a paltry wage, are compelled to work out their barren lives, of the little children who in this system are robbed of their childhood, and in their tender years are seized in the remorseless grasp of mammon, and forced into the industrial dungeons there to feed the monstrous machines while they themselves are being starved and stunted, body and soul. I see them dwarfed and diseased and their little lives broken and blasted because in this high noon of Christian civilization, money is still so much more important than the flesh and blood of childhood. In very truth, gold is God today, and it rules with a pitiless way in the affairs of men. In this country, the most favored beneath the bending skies, We have vast areas of the richest and most fertile soil, material resources in inexhaustible abundance, the most marvelous protective machinery on Earth, and millions of eager workers ready to apply their labor to that machinery to produce in abundance for every man, woman, and child. And if there are still vast numbers of our people who are the victims of poverty, and whose lives are in unceasing struggle all the way from youth to old age, it is not the fault of the Almighty. It cannot be charged to nature. But it is due entirely to the outgrown social system in which we live that ought to be abolished not only in the interest of the toiling masses, but in the higher interest of all of humanity. I believe, Your Honor, that all things that are jointly needed and used ought to be jointly owned. That industry, the basis of our social life, instead of being the private property of a few and operated for their enrichment, ought to be the common property of all, democratically administered in the interest of all. Your Honor, I'm opposing a social order in which it is possible for one man who does absolutely nothing that's useful to amass a fortune of hundreds of millions of dollars, while millions of men and women who work all the days of their lives secure barely enough for a wretched existence. This order of things cannot always endure. I have registered my protest against it, and I recognize the feebleness of my effort. But, fortunately, I am not alone. There are a multiplied thousands of others who, like myself, have come to realize that before we may truly enjoy the blessings of a civilized life, we must reorganize society upon a mutual and cooperative basis. And to this end, we have organized a great economic and political movement that spreads over the face of all of the earth. They are all making common cause, these people. They are spreading with a tireless energy the propaganda of the new social order. They are waiting, watching, and working, hopefully through all of the hours of the day and the night. However, they are still in the minority, but they have learned how to be patient and how to bide their time. They feel, they know indeed, that the time is coming, in spite of all opposition, all persecution, when this emancipating gospel will spread among all the peoples, and when this minority will become the triumphant majority and, sweeping into power, inaugurate the greatest social and economic change in history. In that day, we shall have the universal commonwealth, the harmonious cooperation of every nation with every other nation on earth. Your Honor, I ask no mercy, and I plead for no immunity. I realize that the right must finally prevail. I never so clearly comprehended as I now do the great struggle between the powers of greed and exploitation on the one hand, and upon the other, the rising host of industrial freedom and social justice. I can see the dawn for the better day of humanity. The people are awakening, and in due time, they will and must come to their own. When the mariner, sailing over the tropic seas, looks for relief from his weary watch, he turns his eyes towards the Southern Cross, burning literally over the tip of exclusion. As the midnight approaches, the Southern Cross begins to bend. The whirling worlds change their places, and with starry finger points, the Almighty marks the passage of time upon the dial of the universe. And though no bell may beat the glad tidings, the lookout knows that the midnight is passing, and that relief and rest are close at hand. Let the people everywhere take heart of hope, for the cross is bending, the midnight is passing, and joy, well, joy comes with the morning. I am now prepared to receive your sentence. Thank you.
In 2009, Dolly Parton addressed the graduating class of the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. Her advice to the graduates was this: dream more, care more, be more. Well, thank you so much, and hello, UT, and I just want to say congratulations to every single one of you that graduated here today. I've been waiting back there for you to finish so that I could start up. Anyways, I know this is a big, big day for you and all, and I never dreamed, ever dreamed that I would be a commencement speaker. Now, singing? Yeah, I can do that, no problem. But making speeches? I'm a little nervous. Seriously. I'm nervous because I know that I'm supposed to say something meaningful to you, maybe some good advice for you to always remember. Now, I usually try not to give advice. Information? Yes, but advice? No. But what has worked for me may not work for you. Well, take for instance what works for me. Wigs, tight clothes, push-up bras, high-heeled shoes, 5-inch high-heeled shoes. I wanted to say that the way I look is a country girl's idea of glamour. It came from a very serious place. There was what you call a town trollop in our town. Well, I thought she was the prettiest thing I'd ever seen when I was a little girl, and every chance I'd have to go to town, I'd see her and I'd say, "Oh, she's just so pretty." And they'd say, "Oh, she's just trash." And I thought, that's what I want to be when I grow up. I know that sometimes I may look it, but hopefully I'm a little more than that. Hopefully there's a brain underneath all this hair and a heart underneath them. This entire moment reminds me of the first time I ever got up on stage to sing. Now, I was just a kid, and I was nervous then too, and I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to deliver what the audience wanted from me. But I did sing, and they did applaud. They did want more. Only trouble was, they wanted an encore, and I only had one song. So I just started up and sang the same song again. Don't you worry though, because I'm not going to repeat this speech. I don't care how much you like it. But seriously, I remember all that, you know? It was a start for me. Of course, today's a special day. Remember your parents today, because as you well know, they are as proud of you as they probably ever will be, and they love you as much as they probably ever will. Look at them, they're all emotional, teary-eyed. Seems to me like a good time for you to ask them for a loan. I'm very grateful for my life, but if I had one wish for you, it would be for you to dream more. When I was a kid, I used to stick a tin can on a broom handle. I used to stick it down in the cracks of our old porch, and in my mind's eye, I was standing on a stage with my guitar, singing my heart out into that microphone. And those were not chickens out there in the yard. They were my audience. And that was no ragged dress I was wearing. It was a dress all glitter with rhinestones, and it was made of the finest silk in my mind. So, you have to stay true to your heart and to your dreams. The night I graduated from high school, we were all asked to stand up and talk about what we were going to do for the rest of our lives. When it was my time, I stood right up there and said, "I'm going to Nashville, and I'm going to be a star." Well, the whole place started laughing, and I thought, how odd. Why is everybody laughing? Because that is what I'm going to do. As bad as I felt at that moment, and as embarrassed as I was, it did not shake me from my dreams. So I guess I showed them, huh? And you can do the same. Of course, you have to be careful. Do not confuse dreams with wishes. There's a difference. Dreams are where you visualize yourself being successful at what's important to you to accomplish. Dreams build convictions because you work hard to pay the price to make sure that they come true. Wishes are just hoping that good things will happen, but there's no fire in your gut that causes you to put everything forth to overcome all of the obstacles. So you have to dream more, and never, ever, ever blame somebody else if that doesn't happen. That is in your department. Now, if I had but one favor to ask of you, it's that you care more. Did you ever notice that there's a lot of people out there that do things just well enough to get by? Caring is about striving for perfection. It's about how you look, it's how you prepare, and it's how you keep your promises. I hope that you will always care enough to be on time, to look your best, and to always give every task, every job, everything that you possibly have to give. If you truly care for people, you won't judge them. and then you will learn to appreciate the uniqueness in every soul. If I have but one hope for you, it's that you be more. People are always asking me, what do you want people to say about you 100 years from now? I always say, I want them to say, dang, don't she look good for her age? All joking aside, I think people will remember us for who we were, not how much money we make or how many records we sell. Because I've always said that I've counted my blessings far more than I've counted my money. And my blessings are many. I have a loving family, I have a great hometown, and I live in the best state in the USA. Now I know if my husband Carl Dean was here right now, he would say, haven't you made these people suffer enough? I would say, no, I have not made them suffer enough, and I have not listened to you for 43 years, so why should I start now? Anyways, I would say that Carl is probably right, and it's time I do wrap this up. Thank you.
The first case that opened the nation's eyes to domestic abuse was that of Hedda Nussbaum. For 12 years, she endured physical and psychological trauma at the hands of her husband, who turned her into a lifeless, numb victim. Using her diary as a tool, she was able to transform her nightmarish realities into a message of hope. This is Surviving Intimate Terrorism by Hedda Nussbaum. There's no doubt to me that Joel Steinberg was special. No matter where we were, in my eyes, he was the best-looking, most interesting man in the room. He'd take me to dinner at one or another expensive restaurant several times a week, having no trouble parting with what seemed like an abundant cash supply to treat me. Joel's seeming generosity impressed me greatly, and I thought to myself, how much more glamorous could it get? I loved him. That is why one night, when we were having one of our long bedroom talks, you know, when you feel genuinely close to one another, I turned to him and I said, Joel, I hate it when you hit me. It's painful and it's embarrassing and it makes me feel like you don't love me, but I know that you do. He responded, I hate myself when I hit you. You know I'm not like that. That would be the first and last time we ever discussed the subject. And unfortunately, it would be many years before I realized that his alleged inexcuse to express terrifying in a specified way was just another deceitful excuse. And by that time, it would be too late. Joel was the extreme of an abuser, and so his torment was extremist too. During the last year of our relationship, each day, Joel would count up the number of times he was displeased with something I did or didn't do. For example, if I didn't appear in front of him the instant he called for me, he would count that as 1. If I tried to then explain that I had not heard him call, he would call me a liar and count that as 2. At night, after our daughter was asleep, he would smash me over the head with an exercise bar for each transgression. Blood would gush all over, and he would then command me to clean every drop. Repeatedly, he told me, you can't survive without me. You'd never make it on your own. And I convinced myself he was right. I needed him. He was my teacher and my guide and my support. And I would have killed myself if I had to be without him. But life could be sweet. Occasionally, we'd all go to the playground as a family. And I'd feel so content to be there with them all, feeling the sun on my face, listening to Joel's palaver about anything and everything, and pushing my beautiful baby Lisa on the swings. You know, every parent says that they have the best child, but in this case, it was true. This happened occasionally, on my bruise-free weekends. One terrible night stands out in my mind. The most disgustingly humiliating indignity that he subjected me to was was urinating on my face. The most intolerable part of it all is I let it happen, there on the floor, and all in front of Lisa. I still remember her being clearly puzzled, and I was thoroughly abashed. The only thing worse was when he would ask her, "Should Daddy hit Mommy? Daddy's only trying to help Mommy." Once, after emerging from the bathroom, tear-stained and with new bruises showing, I complained bitterly to Lisa. "But Daddy's helping you," she said, with large amounts of question in her words. The worst of all was the first time that Joel became angry with Lisa, grabbing her by the shoulders and shaking her around. And following the pattern that she'd observed far too often, she simply said nothing. I watched horror-stricken, but silent. It's bad enough that there was no real cause for his anger, but to just see him throw her to the floor was a shock. Later, neither Lisa nor I discussed the incident, and I held my tongue with Joel. As in most abusive households, silence reigned, until one day Lisa was scheduled to join Joel for a business dinner at a fancy restaurant, and she asked me if Joel was still going to take her out. "Well, go in and ask him yourself," I answered encouragingly, using a thoroughly outdated state of mind. I then heard his voice, and then I heard her voice, and then I heard nothing. Suddenly, Joel stood in the bathroom doorway, dressed in only a shirt and undershorts, holding Lisa limp and unmoving in his arms. Stunned, I demanded Joel tell me what had happened. I knocked her down, and she didn't want to get back up. "Relax, let her sleep," he counseled me. I pleaded desperately that she wasn't waking up, and moments later she stopped breathing. Apparently frightened, he finally conceded and granted me permission to call 911. Lisa was taken to the hospital, where she was declared brain dead. And the hospital disconnected her life support the very next day. The last thing I ever saw of my baby girl was one limp arm hanging over the edge of a stretcher. But what did I feel when the judge of the arraignment pronounced Lisa dead? Nothing. Joel's rendition of the story says that he wasn't even present at home whenever Lisa was fatally injured. And he blamed everything that went wrong on me. I saw them all. I heard the judge declare the charges against me, now up to murder. But there was no reaction. All emotions were asleep. I wondered what Joel was thinking. He'd taken so much from me, my youth, my beauty, and my baby. By the time the two assistant district attorneys were on the case, they were already convinced I was innocent. I sincerely hoped that Joel knew that he blew it. He threw the first stone the very first time he hit me. But even so, I feel disloyal. It's absolutely absurd, but I have tears in my eyes when I realize that maybe I'm saved. But Joel's doomed. Finally, the truth I'd blinded myself to for so long suddenly hit me. Joel, you humiliated me and beat me all in front of our child. She had to see her life turning into what mine was. Bruises on top of bruises and blood and beatings. I'm so sorry, Lisa. I now finally see my own responsibility for not saying the truth about Joel until it was too late to save Lisa. So, from this moment forward, I no longer feel in love with Joel Steinberg.
Toni Morrison, the first Black woman to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature, wrote stories that sang alongside the chimes of the oral traditions of her ancestors and the lasting impacts of racism and slavery. In an excerpt from the Song of Solomon, we follow the downfall of a pretty little Black girl whose own low sense of self-worth would leave her to attempt to kill for love and even die slowly for the love of the one she longs for, all while ignoring the cadences of love and of worth from her grandmother Pilot, her mother Reba, and her good friends Guitar and Ruth. It was a long time after he left, that warm September morning, that she was able to relax enough to drop the knife. When it clattered through the linoleum, she brought her arms down oh so slowly and cradled her breasts as though they were two mangoes thumbed over in the marketplace and pushed aside. She stood that way in the little rented room with the sunshine pouring in until Guitar came home. He could not get her to speak or move, so he picked her up in his arms and carried her downstairs. He sat her on the bottom step while he went to borrow a car to drive her home. Terrible as he thought the whole business was, and repelled as he was by mindlessness and love, he could not keep the deep wave of sorrow from engulfing him as he looked at this really rather pretty woman sitting straight as a pole, holding her breasts and staring in front of her out of hollow eyes. The engine of the old car he'd borrowed roared, but he spoke softly to her. You think because he doesn't love you that you are worthless. You think because he doesn't want you anymore that he is right, that his judgment and opinion of you are correct. If he throws you out, then you are garbage. You think he belongs to you because you want to belong to him. Hagar, don't. It's a bad word, belong, especially when you put it with somebody you love. Love shouldn't be like that. Did you ever see the way the clouds love a mountain? They circle all around it. Sometimes you can't even see the mountain for the clouds, but you know what? You go up top and what do you see? His head. The clouds never cover the head. His head pokes through because the clouds let him. They don't wrap him up. They let him keep his head up high, free, with nothing to hide or bind him. Hear me, Hagar? He spoke to her as he would to a very young child. You can't own a human being. You can't lose what you don't own. Suppose you did own him. Could you really love somebody who is absolutely nobody without you? You really want somebody like that? Somebody who falls apart when you walk out the door? You don't, do you? And neither does he. You're turning over your whole life to him. Your whole life, girl. And if it means so little to you that you can just give it away, hand it to him, then why should it mean any more to him? He can't value you more than you value yourself. He stopped. She did not move or give any sign that she had heard him. Pretty woman, he thought. Pretty little black-skinned woman who wanted to kill for love, die for love. The pride, the conceit of these doormat women amazed him. They could not believe or accept the fact that they were unloved. They believed that the world itself was off balance when it appeared as though they were not loved. Why did they think they were so lovable? Why did they think their brand of love was better than, or even as good as, anybody else's? But they did. And they loved their love so much they would kill anybody who got in its way. He looked at her again. Pretty little black girl, pretty little black-skinned girl. What had Pilate done to her? Hadn't anybody told her the things she ought to know? Still, he thought, to have the object of your love, worthy or not, despise you or leave you. Hagar wasn't looking. Wasn't even listening, and when he led her out of the car into Reba's arms, her eyes were still empty. All Pilate and Reba knew to do was love her, and since she would not speak, they brought things to please her. For the first time in life, Reba tried to win things, and also for the first time couldn't. Puzzled and luckless, she dragged herself home, clutching stalks of anything that bloomed along the edges of lots of other people's gardens. These she presented to her daughter, who sat in a chair by the window, or lay in bed fingering her hair. They cooked special things for her, searched for gifts that they hoped would break the spell. Nothing helped. Pilate's lips were still and Reba's eyes full of panic. They brought her lipstick and chocolate milk, a pink nylon sweater, and a fuchsia bed jacket. Reba even investigated the mysteries of making Jell-O, both red and green. Hagar didn't even look at it. The neighbors took up a collection because Pilate and Reba had spent everything getting Hagar the things needed. It didn't amount to much, though, and it was touch and go on whether she'd have a decent funeral. 2 days later, halfway through the service, it seemed as though Ruth was going to be the lone member of the bereaved family there. A female quartet from Linden Baptist Church had already sung Abide With Me. The wife of the mortician had read the condolence cards, and the minister had launched into his naked Kami into this life and naked shall ye depart sermon, which he had always believed suitable for the death of a young woman. And the winos in the vestibule who came to pay their respects to Pilate's girl but who dared not enter had begun to sob when the door swung open and Pilate burst in shouting mercy as though it were a command. A young man stood up and moved toward her. She flung her right arm and almost knocked him down. "I want mercy," she shouted, and began walking toward the coffin, shaking her head from side to side as though somebody had asked her a question and her answer was no. Halfway up the aisle, she stopped, lifted a finger and pointed, then slowly, although her breathing was fast and shallow, she lowered her hand to her side. It was strange. The languorous, limp hand coming to rest at her side while her breathing was coming so quick and fast. "Mercy," she said again, but she whispered it now. "Mercy?" Now she was asking a question. Mercy. It was not enough. The word needed a bottom, a frame. She straightened up, held her head high, and transformed the plea into a note. In a clear bluebell voice, she sang it out, the one word held so long it became a sentence. And before the last syllable had died in the corners of the room, she was answered in a sweet soprano. "I hear you." The people turned around. Reba had entered. Pilate reached out her hand and placed 3 fingers on the edge of the coffin. Now she addressed her words to the woman bordered in gray satin who lay before her. "My baby girl." The 3 words were pumping in her throat as she turned away from the coffin, looking about at the faces of the people seated in the pews. She fastened on the first pair of eyes that were directed toward her. She nodded at the face and said, "My baby girl." She looked for another pair of eyes and told him also, "My baby girl." Moving back down the aisle, she told each face turned toward her the same piece of news. "My baby girl. That's my baby girl." Conversationally, she spoke, identifying Hagar, selecting her away from everybody else in the world who had died, telling in 3 words the full story of the stumped life in the coffin behind her. "My baby girl." Words tossed like stones into a silent canyon. Suddenly, like an elephant who has just found his anger and lifts his trunk over the heads of the little men who want his teeth or his hide or his amazing strength, Pilate trumpeted for the sky itself to hear, and she was loved. It startled one of the sympathetic winos in the vestibule, and he dropped his bottle, spurting emerald glass and jungle red wine everywhere.
The Nightingale and the Rose by Oscar Wilde highlights selflessness and purity of true love and the fertility of mere attraction. "She said that she would dance with me if I brought her red roses," cried the young student. "But in all my garden there are no red roses." From her nest in the holm oak tree, the nightingale heard him, and she looked out through the leaves and wondered, "Ah, on what little things does happiness depend? I have read all that the wise men have written, and all the philosophy are mine. Yet for want of a red rose is my life made wretched." "Here, at last, is a true lover," said the nightingale. "Night after night I have sung of him, though I knew him not. Night after night I have told a story to the stars, and now I see him." "The prince gives a ball tomorrow night," murmured the young student, "and my love will be of the company. If I bring her a red rose, I shall hold her in my arms, and she will lean her head upon my shoulder, and her hand will be clasped in mine. But there is no red rose in my garden, so I shall sit lonely, and she will pass me by, and she will have no heed of me, and my heart will break." "The musicians will sit in their gallery," cried the young student, "and play upon their stringed instruments, and my love will dance to the sound of the harp and the violin. She will dance so lightly to her feet, and will not touch the floor, and the courtiers in their gay dresses will throng around her. But with me, she will not dance, because I have no red rose to give her." He flung himself down on the floor and wept until tears dripped down his beautiful eyes. But the nightingale understood the secret of the student's sorrow, and she sat silent in the oak tree and thought about the mystery of love. So the nightingale flew over to the rose tree that was growing beneath the student's window. "Give me a red rose," she cried, "and I will sing you my sweetest song." But the tree shook its head. "My roses are red," it answered, so red. But the winter has chilled my veins, and I shall have no roses at all this year. "One red rose is all I want. Is there only one rose? Is there any by which way I can get it?" "There is a way," answered the tree, "but it is so terrible that I dare not even tell it to you," said the tree. "I am not afraid." And said the nightingale. "If you want a red rose," said the tree, "you must build it out of music by the moonlight and stain it with your own heart's blood. All night long you must sing to me, and the thorn must pierce your heart, and your lifeblood must flow into my veins and become mine. Death is a great price to pay for a red rose. Life is so very dear to all. Yet, love is better than life. And what is the heart of a bird compared to the heart of a man?" So she spread her brown wings for flight and soared into the air. She swept over the garden like a shadow. The young student was still lying on the grass where she had left him, and the tears were not yet dry. "Be happy," cried the nightingale. "You shall have your red rose. Be happy. I will build it out of music by moonlight and stain it with my own heart's blood. But all that I ask for you in return is that you will be a true lover, for love is far wiser than philosophy. Though she is wise and mightier than power, though he is mighty." "Sing me one last song," he whispered. "I shall feel very, very lonely while you are gone." So the nightingale sang to the oak tree, and her voice was like water bubbling from a silver jar. When she had finished her song, the student got up and went to his room and laid down on his pallet bed and began to think of his love. And soon after time, he fell asleep. And when the moon shone in the heavens, the nightingale flew over to the rose tree and set her breast against the thorn. All night long, the moon lay down and listened. The thorn went deeper and deeper into the heart's breast, and her lifeblood ebbed away from her. And on the topmost spray of the rose tree, there blossomed a marvelous rose. Petal followed petal, as song followed song. "Press closer, little nightingale," said the tree, "or day will become before the night. I'm sorry. "Press closer, little nightingale," cried the tree, "or the day will become before the rose is finished." So the nightingale pressed closer against the thorn, and louder grew her song. And a delicate flush of pink became into the leaves. But the thorn had not yet reached her heart, so the rose heart remained white, for only a nightingale's heart's blood can crimson the heart of a rose. "Press closer, little nightingale," cried the tree, "or day will become before the rose is finished." So the nightingale pressed, and the thorn touched her heart, and pain shot through her. And the marvelous rose became crimson like the rose of the eastern sky. But the nightingale's voice grew fainter, and her little wings began to beat, and a film became over her eyes. Fainter and fainter grew her song, and she felt something choking in her throat. Then she gave one last burst of music. The white moon heard it. She forgot the dawn and lingered on into the sky. The red rose heard it and trembled all over with ecstasy and opened its petals into the cold morning air. "Look, look," cried the tree. "The rose is finished now." But the nightingale made no answer, for she was lying dead in the long grass, with a thorn in her heart. At noon, the student opened his window and looked out. "Why, what a wonderful piece of luck," he cried. "Here's a red rose. I have never seen any rose like this in my whole entire life." And he leaned down and plucked it. Then he put it on his hat and ran up to the professor's house with the rose in his hand. The daughter of the professor was sitting down in the doorway, winding blue silk on a reel. "You said you would dance with me if I brought you a red rose," cried the young student. "Here is the reddest rose in all the world, and you will wear it next to your heart as we dance together, and I will tell you how I love you." But the girl frowned. "I'm afraid it will not go with my dress," she answered. "And besides, the chamberlain's nephew has sent me some real jewels, and everybody knows that jewels cost far more than flowers." "Well, upon my word, you are very ungrateful," said the student angrily, and he threw the rose into the street, where it fell into the gutter and a cartwheel went over it. "Ungrateful," said the girl. "I tell you what, you are very rude. And after all, who are you? Only a student. Why, I don't believe you have even gotten silver buckles on your shoes, as the chamberlain nephew has." And she got up from her chair and went into the house. "What a silly thing love is," said the student as he walked away. "In fact, it is quite unpractical, and as in my age, practical is everything. I shall go back to philosophy and study metaphysics." So he returned to his room and pulled out a great dusty book and began to read. Thank you.
In 1908, Lucy Maud Montgomery brought to life the feisty red-haired girl named Anne Shirley. In her imagination, anything can happen. She finally belongs to a family and grows up in a home with enough love for her and her spirit to grow. This is Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery.
I was 11 last March, said Anne, resigning herself to the bald facts with a little sigh. And I was born in Bolingbroke, Nova Scotia. My father's name was Walter Shirley, and he was a teacher in Bolingbroke High School. My mother's name was Bertha Shirley. Aren't Walter and Bertha lovely names? I'm so glad my parents had such nice names. It'd be a real disgrace to have a father named, well, say, Jedediah, wouldn't it? I guess it doesn't matter what a person's name is, as long as he behaves himself, said Marilla, feeling herself called upon to pass on a good and useful moral. Well, I don't know, said Anne, looked thoughtful. I read in a book once that a rose by any other name would smell sweet, but have never been able to believe it. I do not believe a rose would smell as sweet if it was called a thistle or a skunk cabbage. I suppose my father could have been a good man, even if he had been called Jebediah, but I'm sure it would have been cross. Well, my mother was a teacher in high school too, but when she married father, she gave up teaching. Of course, a husband was enough responsibility to deal with. Miss Thomas said they were a pair of babies, and as poor as church mice. They went to live in a weeny teeny little yellow house in Bolingbroke. I've never seen that house, but I've imagined it 1,000 times. I think it must have had honeysuckle over the parlor windows, and lilacs in the front yards, and lilies of the valley just inside the gate. Yes, and muslin curtains in all the windows. Muslin curtains give a house such an air. I was born in that house. Miss Thomas said I was the homeliest baby she had ever saw. I was so scrawny and tiny, and nothing but eyes, but that mother thought I was perfectly beautiful. I should think a mother would be a better judge than a poor woman who came in a scrub, wouldn't you? I'm glad she was satisfied with me anyhow. I would feel so sad if she thought I was a disappointment to her, because she didn't live very long after that. You see, she'd lived long enough for me to remember calling her mother. I think it'd be so sweet to say mother again, don't you? And father died 4 days afterwards from fever too. That left me, an orphan. And folks were at their wits' end what to do with me, so Miss Thomas said what to do. You see, nobody wanted me even then. It seems to be my fate. Father and mother had both come from places far away, and it was well known they had any living relatives. Finally, Miss Thomas said she'd take me. Though she was poor and had a drunken husband, she brought me up by hand. Do you know, if there's anything in being brought up by hand that ought to make people who are brought up that way better than any other people? Because whenever I was naughty, Miss Thomas would ask, how could I be such a bad girl when she brought me up by hand, reproachful-like? Mr. and Mrs. Thomas moved away from Bolingbroke to Marysville, and I lived with them until I was 8 years old. Then Mr. Thomas was killed falling under a train, and his mother offered to take Miss Thomas and the children in, but she didn't want me. Then Miss Hammond took me in, seeing I was good with children. Mr. Hammond worked in a little sawmill up there, and Miss Hammond had 8 children. I used to get dreadfully tired carrying them about. I lived there for over 2 years, and then Mr. Hammond died, and Miss Hammond broke up the housekeeping. She divided her children among her relatives, and she went to the States. I had to go to the asylum at Hopeton, because no one would take me. Anne finished up with another sigh, of relief this time. Evidently, she did not like talking about her experiences in a world that had not wanted her. Were those women, Miss Thomas and Miss Hammond, good to you? Asked Marilla, looking at Anne out of the corner of her eye. Oh, faltered Anne. Her sensitive little face suddenly flushed scarlet, and embarrassment sat on her brow. Oh, they meant to be good to me. I know they meant to be just as good and as kind as possible. And when people mean to be good to you, you don't mind very much when they're not quite always. They had a good deal to worry them. You know, it must have been very trying to have a drunken husband, and it must have been very trying to have 8 children, don't you think? But I feel sure they meant to be good to me. Marilla watched the scenery abstractedly, while she pondered deeply. Pity was suddenly stirring in her heart for the child. What a starved, unloved life she had had. A life of drudgery, poverty, and neglect. For Marilla was shrewd enough to read between the lines of Anne's history and divine the truth. No wonder she'd been so delighted at the prospects of a real home. It was a pity she had to be sent back to the orphanage. What if Marilla should indulge Matthew's unaccountable whim and let her stay? He was set on it, and the child seemed like a nice, teachable little thing. She's got too much to say, thought Marilla, but she might be trained out of that, and there's nothing rude or slangy in what she does say. She's ladylike, It's likely her people were nice folks. The shore road was woodsy and wild and lonesome. On the right hand, scrub firs, their spirits quite unbroken by long years of tussle with the gulf winds that grew quickly. "Isn't the sea wonderful?" said Anne, rousing from a long, wide-eyed silence. "Once, when I lived in Maurysville, Mr. Thomas hired an express wagon and took us all to spend the day at the shore, 10 miles away. I enjoyed every moment of that day, even if I had to look after the children all the time. But this shore is much nicer than Maurysville shore. Aren't those gulls splendid? Would you like to be a gull? I think I would, that is if I couldn't be a human girl. Don't you think it'd be nice to wake up at sunrise and swoop down over the water and away over that blue all day, and then at night fly back to one's nest? Oh, I can just imagine myself doing it." "What big house is that just ahead?" Anne asked Marilla. "Well, that's the White Sands Hotel. Mr. Kirk runs it, but the sea sun hasn't begun yet. There are heaps of Americans that come here for the summer. They think that shore is just about right for them." "I was afraid it might be Miss Spencer's place," said Anne mournfully. "I don't want to get there. Somehow, it'll seem like the end of everything."
Meaning can be found in the simplest of things, because what can represent truth, goodness, and beauty to some can be nothing more than a flower to others. The Nightingale and the Rose shows how realistic and bitter self-sacrifice can be for the sake of the wrong person's happiness. "She said that she would dance with me if I brought her red roses, but in all my garden there is no red rose." From her nest in the oak elm tree, the nightingale heard him, and she looked out through the leaves and wondered. "Here at last is a true lover," said the nightingale. "Night after night have I sung of him, though I knew him not. Night after night have I told his story to the stars, and now I see him. His hair is dark as the hyacinth blossom, and his lips are as red as the rose of his desire, but passion has made his lace like pale ivory, and sorrow has set her seal upon his brow." The nightingale understood the secret of the student's sorrow, and she sat silent in the oak tree and thought about the mystery of love. Suddenly, she spread her brown wings for flight and soared into the air. In the center of the grass plot was standing a beautiful rose tree, and when she saw it, she flew over to it and lit upon a spray. "Give me a red rose," she cried, "and I will sing you my sweetest song." But the tree shook its head. "My roses are yellow, but go to my brother who grows beneath the student's window, and perhaps he will give you what you want." So the nightingale flew over to the rose tree that was growing beneath the student's window. "Give me a red rose, and I will sing you my sweetest song." But the tree shook its head. "My roses are red, but the winter has chilled my veins, and the frost has nipped my buds, and the storm has broken my branches, and I shall have no roses at all this year." "One red rose is all I want, only one red rose. Is there no way by which I can get it?" "There is a way, but it is so terrible that I dare not tell it to you." "Tell it to me. I am not afraid." "If you want a red rose, you must build it out of music by moonlight. You must sing to me with your breast against a thorn. All night long you must sing to me, and the thorn must pierce your heart." Death is a great price to pay for a red rose. Life is very dear to all. It is pleasant to sit in the greenwood with the sun in his chariot of gold and the moon in her chariot of pearl. Yet love is better than life, and what is the heart of a bird compared to the heart of a man? So she spread her brown wings for the flight and soared into the air.
The young student was still lying on the grass where she had left him, and the tears were not yet dry in his beautiful eyes. Be happy, be happy. You shall have your red rose. All that I ask of you in return is that you will be a true lover. The student looked up from the grass and listened, but he could not understand what the nightingale was saying to him, for he only knew of the things that are written down in books. When the moon shone in the heavens, the nightingale flew to the rose tree and set her breast against the thorn. All night long she sang, and the cold crystal moon leaned down and listened. All night long she sang, and the thorn went deeper and deeper into her breast. She sang first of the birth of love in the heart of a boy and a girl, and on the topmost spray of the rose tree there blossomed a marvelous rose, petal following petal as song followed song. Press closer, little nightingale, or the day will come before the rose is finished. So the nightingale pressed closer against the thorn, and louder grew her song, for she sang of the birth of passion in the soul of a man and a maid. And a delicate blush of pink came into the leaves of the rose, but the thorn had not yet reached her heart, so the rose's heart remained white. For only a nightingale's heart's blood can crimson the heart of a rose. Press closer, little nightingale, or the day will come before the rose is finished. So the nightingale pressed closer against the thorn, and the thorn touched her heart, and a fierce pang of pain shot through her. Bitter was the pain, for she sang of the love that is perfected by death, of the love that dies not in the tomb. And the marvelous rose became crimson, like the rose of the eastern sky. Crimson was the girdle of petals, and crimson as a ruby was the heart. But the nightingale's voice grew fainter. Her little wings began to beat, and a film came over her eyes. Fainter and fainter grew her song. She gave one last burst of music. The white moon heard it, and she forgot the dawn and lingered on in the sky. The red rose heard it, and it trembled all over with ecstasy and opened its petals to the cold morning air. Look, the rose is finished now. But the nightingale made no answer, for she was lying dead in the long grass with the thorn in her heart. At noon, the student opened his window and looked out. What a wonderful piece of luck! Here is a red rose! I have never seen any rose like it in all my life. And he leaned down and plucked it. Then he put on his hat and ran up to the professor's house with the rose in his hand. The daughter of the professor was sitting in the doorway, winding blue silk on a reel, and her little dog was lying at her feet. You said that you would dance with me if I brought you a red rose. Here is the reddest rose in all the world. You will wear it tonight as we dance together. It will tell you how I love you. But the girl frowned. I'm afraid it will not go with my dress. And besides, the Chamberlain's nephew has sent me some real jewels, and everybody knows that jewels cost far more than flowers. You are very ungrateful! And he threw the rose into the street, where it fell into the gutter.